of Deuteronomy, Moses recounts what God had done delivering the nation of Israel from Egypt. He restates the Ten Commandments. And in the first 5 chapters there, Moses gives his intention for the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy is not written so that people might look at it and follow the laws and become righteous before God. Instead, Deuteronomy is written so that it would go well with the Israelites, so that they would live long in the land that God was providing them, the land of Canaan, the promised land. And so this book, Deuteronomy, is a practical law. It is a law Moses writes. They have come out of Egypt. They have been in the wilderness for 40 years. Egypt is still struggling. This is just after the downfall, I think, of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. There is a dark age that follows that on the historical timeline, and so Moses is considering that. He does not want Israel to fail as a nation moving into the land of Canaan. And so just before they enter the land of Canaan, after their 40-year sojourn in the wilderness, they're about to enter Canaan. Moses writes Deuteronomy to recapitulate the law and expand on the law. He says that he's doing so in the first 5 chapters so that Israel may prosper, unlike Middle Egypt, so that the same things that led to Egypt's demise would not also lead to Israel's demise in the future. Now in our Sunday school class on Sunday mornings, we are learning about biblical manhood and womanhood, and right now we are spending some time in the law. This Sunday may be the last time that we spend in the law. But in Deuteronomy chapter 22 and verse 5, we see a verse that instructs women not to dress like men and men not to dress like women, because essentially cross-dressing is an abomination to God. Now, context is key in understanding anything that the Bible has to say to us. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 20, Moses says he writes the law, the commands in the law, in order to test the people, to increase their fear of God, and it is their fear of God that leads them not to sin. So there is something spiritual going on here, but overall Deuteronomy is something different than Exodus, even though the law still has the same bend, still has the same intent there regarding our spiritual lives, our relationship with God, and our rejection of sin. There's something else going on in Deuteronomy. Moses intends for it to be a practical code by which to live and become prosperous. It does not make a person righteous following these laws, but they are practical laws that lead to the success of a nation, according to Moses' perception. He grew up a prince of Egypt. He saw all of the things that were going on in Egypt that led to Egypt's demise. And when God came in and rescued Israel out of Egypt, Egypt was already on the decline. God was just putting the nails in the coffin, so to speak, in Egypt. So Moses writes this law down. Women don't dress like men. Men don't dress like women. It is not good for society. In fact, it is an abomination before God. What is an abomination before God? Because God created men to be the picture of Him and His relationship with the world, with creation. And God created women to be a picture of creation, particularly humanity, in relationship to Himself. God is distinguished from His creation. He does not disguise Himself as His creation. God does not mix with His creation. In fact, He cannot, right? He is distinct from, He is holy. His creation is something different than Him. His creation, humanity, we cannot be God. We cannot mix with God. We cannot intermingle with the essence of God, right? We are something distinct. So when God creates humanity as a picture of Himself, and He creates men to be men, and He creates women to be women, we sort of mock him if we transvesticize ourselves, right? We sort of mock him if men are uh, becoming women, so to speak, and if women are becoming men, so to speak, or presenting themselves as such, because God created us to be a picture of who He is. So this is an abomination before God, but also it works out practically because Moses' intention here is to have a practical, well-built, prosperous, long-lasting society, right? A society where people prosper, do well, and live long in the land that the Lord their God is giving them. So we look at the heart issue behind when people present themselves as something other than they actually are. Like this isn't the problem. Cross-dressing has never been the problem. Transvestitism has never been the problem. Homosexuality has never been the problem. Transgenderism has never been the problem of society. I want to get that straight from the beginning. The problem in our society, I think, is a heart issue. I think it's uh, pride. I think it's the love of self. I think it's entitlement. I think these heart attitudes have always been the problems of societies. It certainly was the problem in Egypt. It certainly was a problem in Rome. I think when Rome fell, I think pride, selfishness, entitlement, I think it leads to the fall of civilization as a whole. And so, in order for a civilization to thrive, to prosper in a long lasting way, in order for it to be around for a long time, that society has to be made up of people who are essentially humble, people who put others first, people who consider others to be more important than themselves, people who are not afraid of suffering on behalf of others, people who stand up for others, people who don't always have to have their way, people who don't have to fulfill their own lusts and desires, people who do not have to identify themselves according to their own wants and what they perceive to be their own needs. And so this epidemic, I think, of transgenderism, transvestitism, even in the drag races that are becoming popular now, this epidemic ultimately stems from the problem of pride, selfishness, entitlement. And it is this pride, this selfishness, this entitlement that ultimately destroys cultures, destroys societies. So when we read verses like Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 5, women dress like women, men dress like men, this comes from the motivation of the author, Moses' motivation. This comes from his motivation to keep the nation of Israel from ending up like Middle Egypt. This is Moses like concerned about the future of Israel moving into the promised land. Moses himself will not inherit the promised land. He doesn't get to move in, but he wants there to be generations upon generations upon generations of Hebrew children raised in Israel's new promised land. And in order to see the longevity of a society, it ultimately boils down to people don't need to be so prideful that they feel the need to identify themselves. Instead, men, be who you were created to be. Act like men. Because God has created you to be men. Your body's different. Your brain's different. God created you to do stuff that's different from the stuff that He created women to do. So do that. It's good for you. It's good for society, and it glorifies God. The same for women. God created your brains different. God created your bodies different. God created you to do different stuff that men aren't so good at doing. So do that. Be that. Be who you were created to be. It is good for society as a whole, and it brings glory to God.